All right. So thank you for joining us for session 5 of Justice University, where we're going to be covering practical applications of the Just Third Way and mechanisms of the Economic Democracy Act. And these are going to include a very, very brief overview of the employee stock ownership plan, because it's an existing mechanism in the law. But then the most important from the standpoint of what we call the Just Third Way is the capital ownership account, because it's dealing directly with each human being. Then we have another mechanism which is now in law but needs to be put into implementation. That's the Citizens Land Development Cooperative. We also have, we're going to just mention the Consumer or Customer Stock Ownership Plan, and also the
Bluetooth.
and could I just ask if you're not speaking, just because we'll get your background sound, if you could mute yourself if you're not speaking, and as well as the Homeowners Equity Corporation. And I have to say again, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to zoom through slides that have been prepared, and it'll lose you. I mean, if I were listening to it, it would lose me too, because it's just so much. But I will make this PowerPoint available to you, and I think the text in it, in combination with the reading assignments, should give you a better idea. But really, this is getting into the technical area of design, where you're taking theory and putting it into application, understanding that every situation is going to be slightly different, whether in terms of culturally, economically, socially, etc. But the same universal principles need to apply, and it's a matter of how you tailor those to the situation. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to make the presentation, which may run kind of long, because there's more in this than in any of the other sessions, and could I ask that you jot down any questions that occur to you, write them down, so when we get to the question and answer session, we're going to let all the participants raise their questions, and our panelists, Norm Kurland and Mike Graney, will help respond to those. So I'm going to now go right to the slides, make sure I have everything ready. Okay. I always hate it when these things. All right, so this is session 1. And just to remind all of us, the theoretical basis, the moral basis of the system we call the Just Third Way, which has also been called personalism or economic personalism when we talk about economics, is the basis is the human person and the dignity and empowerment of each person from the day they're born till the day they die. And just to mention some of the key top concepts that relate to this is the person, and we see that is not just in each individual who is unique and has inalienable rights, but also the person as a social being as well. And the development of each of us it must be seen within a social context. We're not totally isolated individuals. We create institutions as invisible tools to help each of us develop, or at least that's what we should be aiming towards. Power, we discussed as something that is both essential for freedom and for growth and development, but it is also something that if it gets concentrated, it inevitably leads to corruption. And you can see it spilling over from economics into politics and other areas of life. Property, to reiterate, are the rights and powers that an owner has with respect to not only his or her own labor, but also capital, the non-human things that are used to produce goods and services. So that is a definable rights. It relates to distributive justice. Just to keep the P's all in order, we're talking about money, and that is critical to changing the system, how we define it, how we create it, how we make it available as a social tool, but serving within a free market system. That is critical to understanding how these practical applications, why we insist on reforms to major institutions if we want to achieve justice for every person. So we also talked about how the system must spread capital ownership to each person. Without that, you can't have a truly free market system and you can't have a just society. So we discussed the reasons why Kelso and Adler drew a connection between economic democracy and political democracy. And as Norm likes to point out, we need to remember that just as the ballot serves to connect the human person to the political system and political democracy, money is the social connection of each person to the economic system if we want an economic democracy. And what's also very important, and this session will talk about how this is done, but we need to consider when we talk about any new capital formation or technological development, we need to look at how it's being financed, because that will determine who ultimately owns. And if the financing is done through the old way, past savings, the already accumulated savings of past production, and only a few people have enough of that to invest in capital, well, then the ownership is going to end up with those people. So Kelso figured out a way to break the chains of past savings as the only way, or what we think is the only way, to finance new growth. And we also need to see that these changes need to be embedded in our institutions. So and we need to think in terms of systems, not only individual interactions between human beings and organizations, but really in terms of the invisible structures that determine our relationship and our rights and powers with regard to other people, with regard to the processes of change, with regard to the productive system. So we're going to look very, very closely at money and credit as being the critical lever for changing the economy from what is now very concentrated power to one that democratizes economic power and access to credit just by virtue of the design of the system. And just to remind us about the definition of money that we're focusing on, we're using Louis Kelso's, which looks at money as a yardstick, a way of measuring value in all of our transactions in the economy, and knowing that each of us should be coming as empowered participants in the economy who are free to make choices as to how we value what we're giving in exchange for what others are offering. And so we have to come to some common understanding for measuring that, and money helps us to do that. It also, we stress that it should not be viewed as a commodity which is sold and traded and basically is viewed as valuable in and of itself. It is only valuable insofar it brings about real economic production, transactions, etc. But it itself is it's really an abstract concept, even though it can take the form of paper bills or electronic bookkeeping. It's really the idea. And we also need to think in terms of how we have a stable money system, so that wherever we happen to be, whoever we're engaging in transaction with, we know that we're speaking from the same page. We know we're using the same measurement. So one proposal, since at the moment we're not tied to any particular standard. It used to be gold and silver, and it could be a number of different standards. One proposal is what Buckminster Fuller was talking about in terms of if we had a global grid where everyone had instantaneous access to anywhere in the world and essentially one price for kilowatt hours, we could use that. I want to say that this is an area that deserves a lot more discussion, and there are other thoughts on that. But the important thing is we have to know what our money is worth, how it's measuring the value of goods and services. The vehicles we'll be looking at today, which we would say these are economic democratization vehicles, are the primary one is the capital ownership account, which is connects every person individually to the growth in the economy. We have employee stock ownership plans, which exist in the law now, and they're designed for corporate employees. The CLDC, which is designed to create equal ownership opportunities for every resident within a defined geographical area. And then we have the CSOP, Customer Stock Ownership Plan, which mainly would be for utility customers or could be for something like Amazon, where instead of a few people really owning the bulk, the customers would have ownership with specific shares. And in addition to that, we've developed something called the Homeowners Equity Corporation, which is a way to enable everyone to acquire a home using the mechanisms I'll be describing, but it's a different thing. It's ultimately buying a consumer item, but it's somewhat hybrid because it's using capital finance, and you'll see that it still has to meet certain standards in order for it to work. Ownership unions are a way that we think labor unions should transform into, because the interest of every person in the economy is going to have to go beyond just labor contributions to their ownership contributions. Some key points of how we design, how we take principles of the just third way and put them into the design of these specific vehicles. We have to take into consideration, number one, feasibility. If a project cannot pay for itself out of its future profits, it's going to have to get money to repay a loan from somewhere. It should not continue to be from the government, or it's really the taxpayer. But ultimately, it should come from the people who are using it, who are going to be buying and selling. And the point of feasibility is you only buy, in terms of capital financing, something that is projected to be able to pay itself off, its loan off with future profits. So there's a whole discipline involved with determining feasibility, and this will be key in the future. Also, in terms of the design we're talking about, it should reflect the idea of equality of ownership opportunity, which means that if we limit ourselves to past savings, and some people have more past savings than others, that will skew ownership opportunity to the current halves. So that's why the idea of future savings money, and I know that drives a lot of people crazy to hear that, but it's newly created money that's asset backed, or really future production backed money. So that is key. If we want to talk about equality of ownership opportunity, it's look at, he who holds the gold makes the rules, or owns the thing. So we have to look at where the gold is coming from, and I use that word very loosely. Full private property rights. We also need to recognize that today ownership in corporate equity has very little to do with private property rights. It does not pay out to the owners the full stream of profits that they are due. And in many cases, the owners don't have real control over what they own. So in these designs, we're going to presume, according to the way we would design using just third way principles, that these three elements in particular are always kept in mind. And if they're not, we need to go back and see what the problem is. Or in some cases, we may have to adjust to a reality of a situation, but always aiming back towards these ideals. As I said, the employee stock ownership plan is now recognized under the law as an expanded ownership vehicle qualified under U.S. retirement law, which can borrow on behalf of workers as a group to acquire equity shares in the sponsoring employer company, which are repayable with pre-tax profits or dividends. And there's a lot in that paragraph there. But in order to qualify as an ESOP, you have to meet certain conditions, and it's also, as I'll point out later, something which a true ESOP does not require workers to put up their own money. It also mentions here that loans through an ESOP are repayable with pre-tax profits, which is really important, because if you pay, you generate your profits, and if you're paying after you pay a tax, obviously that's you're going to end up with less money. So the idea of pre-tax is that it's another way of saying it is that the expenses are deductible. So this is before your profits are taxed, and that's very important for making the ESOP an attractive way of financing growth. It was invented by Louis Kelso, and it's now the only one of our, we should adjust this. It's the only one in implementation of the just third way mechanisms. The CLDC has gotten into law in Missouri, so it's a very important first step, and we want to replicate this throughout all 50 states, but ultimately we want the idea of the CLDC to be universally accessible, not only in this country, but throughout the world. And we see that the ESOP idea is spread over decades to other countries. The UK has a number of models. You have in Latin America things which are close to the ESOP. Australia is another. Huawei in China is supposed to be an ESOP. You know, you always look at how the plan is set up to determine whether the three elements we were talking about exist, if we're going to call it a true ESOP. And most ESOPs are not reflective of those necessarily those three principles. So they're not all the same quality, but under US law, they have to meet certain conditions. And also the idea of cooperatives is very close to that of ESOPs in terms of those cooperatives that have property rights attached to shares. The difference mainly being that cooperatives are voted one person, one vote, versus ESOPs, which are the share-based, one share, one vote. The key to ESOP is that it is a corporate form of business organization or mechanism, which brings in advanced financing techniques. So it really was designed by Kelso to enable workers to have access to money for capital formation, make that available to workers the same way the rich have that means. And okay, this is where I'm going to try and keep to, this is going to go fast. And as I say, I'll make this available to people. If we understand how the ESOP works generally in terms of loans, you'll see how the pattern carries over to the others. But an ESOP trust is formed by the sponsoring corporation, and it's in order to purchase and own the company shares on behalf of the workers. So you have the trust, which is something that shields the employees from the risk of the corporation going under. Their assets cannot be seized. It also, while anything is inside the ESOP, it's not taxed. So the ESOP trust borrows on behalf of all the workers, gets a loan, and it purchases shares, generally from the existing owner. Um, if they're newly issued shares, it would purchase those. So then the plan sponsor, which is generally the corporation, will make tax deductible cash contributions to the trust, which then flows that repayment back to the lender to repay the share acquisition loan. And as the share acquisition loan is repaid, all these shares which are held in what's called a suspense account are released and allocated to each of the workers' ESOP account. So the employees are called beneficial owners. The ESOP trust is the legal owner, and it's set up to uh, insulate each of the workers from any personal liability. So here we see the diagrams of how this works, where the corporation forms the ESOP. And in this case, it's where existing stock is purchased with a loan to the ESOP. So this is generally from an owner who may be retiring. Okay, when the loan is repaid, the sponsoring company continues to make cash contributions. So this is, as I said before, it's part of retirement plans. And so this is not only a way of financing capital growth, it's also a way for people to accumulate equity while they're working in the company so they have something when they retire. And I'm just going to say that Kelso really intended this to be part of really its own body of law. So it just happened historically to end up in retirement law. And there's this subjects it to very stringent rules in terms of risk. And there's a whole history behind why it ended up in that. But we're trying to create mechanisms that are ownership based. So the ESOP can pay out dividends and get a tax deduction for dividends. And so it's the only financing mechanism that can do that, is to deduct the dividends it pays out. And first it would use the dividends to repay loans. So here we see the diagram, which you'll see when I'll send you the PowerPoint. When the company's paying out its profits, it first repays the loan, and anything else is either held in the ESOP trust or it's paid out as cash dividends, which the corporation can deduct, and it becomes taxable personal income to the recipients. And then at the very end of the process, and I kind of skipped over the notion of vesting, and that just means when you're entitled to the full ownership rights over your shares. And this is flexible within the ESOP. But the notion is if you have any unvested shares, you're not going to, you're not entitled to the value of. So it's the vested shares that give you the rights, the full rights under the ESOP. So when the person retires or leaves the company, the shares are distributed, and then the person generally will sell them back to the ESOP and get the cash value. And everything is determined by an appraised fair market value. All right, and okay, this is a little more detail about what happens with an ESOP at the point where the person is now entitled to those shares to either sell them or, if the plan allows, take them with them. And the problems with ESOPs as they now exist is that usually they're going to be based on relative compensation. And that just means if you earn more because of your pay, like the CEO, you earn more than the janitor, then when the shares are allocated, they're going to be allocated on the same basis. So if you earn more, you're going to get more shares allocated. If you earn less, you get less. And the problem with this, there's a number of problems, is that it really is not reflecting the principles of binary economics, which recognizes the relative contributions of your labor input and your capital input. And it also doesn't recognize that if you use future savings, meaning if the money you use is not borrowed or contributed by any individual, then in justice, no one should automatically be assumed to be due a higher allocation of shares. If we're all none of us are risking, none of us are putting money into the purchase of the shares, but we're all able to get access to capital credit, then according to binary economics, the allocation of the shares really should be equal. Okay, no one is risking more or losing, putting up any more. So then there's some other technical things which Mike Graney, as a ESOP administrator, can explain in greater depth. And also many ESOPs don't grant full ownership rights. Whether most don't pay out dividends the way we say they should. And they also don't spread voting rights beyond what's required under law. And from our standpoint in talking about changing the system, the big problem with ESOPs, and there's many good things about the ESOPs. Many studies have shown, this is over decades, that where you have a very participatory ESOP with the equity sharing over the long term, short-term economic feedback in the form of profits, cash bonuses based on profits, and some participatory design for enabling people to have a voice in governance as well as in the daily operations. Where you have these elements, the profitability of those companies that do this is 150% higher than similar companies without those design features. But the big problem with the ESOP, and why the ESOP alone is not going to be able to transform our economy, is that it's only designed to benefit corporate employees. So all the people in the public sector, most teachers, people who are unemployed, people who are retired, children, disabled people, none of those would be covered if they're not corporate employees. They're not going to be able to participate through the ESOP. So we need some more universal means of spreading ownership. This is something, we have a paper on that. Our design, trying to follow as best we can the principles of the just third way. And so we have something you can look at online describing this, what we call justice-based management S Corp ESOP. S Corp is just recognized under the law as something like a partnership where the partners are taxed on whatever income is earned. And since with an ESOP it's tax exempt, and where it is the only owner of the company, the ESOP trust, what that does is it enables that S corporation to not have to pay corporate taxes. And the only time taxes are paid are where shares are distributed or taken out, or if there are any dividends, and those taxes are to the recipients. So there's a lot of, in terms of corporate finance, it's a really very, very cost-effective means. Now, this is the most important of the mechanisms, and these are the capital ownership accounts. And as we said, these are some of the limitations of ESOPs, only cover corporate employees, our retirement plans, and they're based today largely on what you earn through your labor. And how we set up the capital ownership account is very similar, that you have essentially a trust for each person. So what that does is it will be doing the borrowing, or it will be the recipient of the capital credit when that is created, and it will be what pays off the loan from the profits of the shares it's purchased. So what that does is it insulates all the other property of the individual from being seized if a loan goes bad. And as we were saying, it doesn't require that any person be a genius at investing, managerial guru or anything else. We want to encourage every citizen to become more educated in terms of ownership and economics and finance, but this will open up a field of financial advisors to help people determine which of the qualified shares would be best to purchase. So there's already that idea of qualifying before people have something to choose from. Okay, and this will also bring in the idea of capital credit insurance. Okay, as the shares in a COA EDA, that means shares that have been purchased by the COA, earn dividends. This is what's first used to repay the loan. And when they're fully paid for, these shares, and each year you're getting a new credit allocation and purchasing new shares, these very special shares that are full voting, full dividend payout. When the shares are paid for, then that becomes a new source of income. And that's really the point we're looking at, that this shouldn't just be for retirement. It should be creating ownership income for you from really starting at the day you're born until the day you die. And the system can be designed to do that. And so there's going to be certain tax advantages that creating these shares will have in selling them. Okay, and so as we said, each year there's going to be an annual determination of how much capital credit is going to be created depending on how many newly issued shares these corporations are planning to sell. So everything is going to really be kicked off by corporations knowing how much they need in order to purchase capital for the coming year. And so connecting the individuals through their COAs to the selling companies, that's part of the whole system. And this would be available to every child and adult. So rather than going through the diagram, which I could spend really the whole session on, there's a link which takes you to an assignment, which I think was either assigned for this class or for the next, but I recommend that you go through it. We try and take it step by step, and that is how you finance green growth through capital ownership accounts and how the banking, commercial banking and central banking and insurance come into play. And again, the problem is it's not in the law yet, but we're trying various approaches to get it into law. The other mechanism is the Citizens Land Development Cooperative, which we now have passed in Missouri, and Jean Gordon is working to get that established and implemented starting in St. Louis. But the CLDC could be the owner of land, primarily infrastructure and natural resources, but primarily land and infrastructure. And this is uses a similar idea of private ownership, joint private ownership, but in this case, we're talking about equal ownership by each person. So rather than having the person being able to purchase different numbers of shares in different companies, they would all, if they live in a certain area, would be covered under the CLDC. Okay, and so this is not just for corporate employees, but really residents of a certain area. And the first step would be for whatever land is owned by the government, whether it's local or state or national, would be transferred free to the CLDC, because we're saying, okay, if the government owns it, isn't the government represents all the people? So this is just connecting the people to ownership more directly. But then the problem is going to remain. You may have this land, but you're going to need to spend money in order to develop it. Okay, so there's going to be various steps that will take place in terms of how the CLDC is going to be able to generate income to pay off any loans it gets in order to develop the land and infrastructure. And largely that will come through leasing land, leasing land to companies that want to do business. And so those lease fees that's the income that's generated by the CLDC. And when expenses are paid off, then any additional residual would be paid out to the residents as dividends. Okay, and in this CLDC, there would be each person would have a single voting, no cost, non-transferable share. This is lifetime, that they would be surrendered if the person leaves the area. Okay, and so their share is canceled. If they come back, I'm going to just I have some interference coming on. Let's see, I'm not sure who that is. Okay, so how this is set up, there's much more detail, but the idea is that while you're in the area, you get one share, full dividend payout, full voting share. If you leave, you surrender it or it gets canceled. If you come back, another share is established for you. Then we have consumer stock ownership plans, which would use the same idea of being able to borrow in order to build whatever the utility company may need. But with that new financing, creating ownership for the customers. And let's see. All right. All right. And so this would mainly deal with customers of the utility, and it could be for water, gas, electricity, public transportation. And also now we have companies like Amazon could also be participants in the using a CSOP. Again, it doesn't exist yet. I want to just mention as an aside, we were recently put in touch with an associate of Patricia Kelso's in the Kelso Institute, who's a professor at a university in Germany. And he has been teaching Kelso's ideas. And really, I think the big emphasis in Europe at this point is the CSOP. So that's what they're looking at in terms of how they finance new energy systems. So we haven't talked with them yet, but he got in touch with us and we want to sort of trade ideas with him. But the CSOP, it has a lot of attractive features, but we would also say that the capital ownership account could serve the same purpose in that if the individual chooses to use their credit allocation to purchase shares of a utility company that needs financing, this could be done more directly through the COA than the CSOP, but there may be reasons where a CSOP would fit well. Okay, and I'm gonna run through these because it's 15 of. But one thing to keep in mind is that all these mechanisms should be able to function in a free market system with market valuations and not without government interference or setting artificial prices or putting up protectionist measures. So you may not start with that situation, but we would design it so that it can compete on a free market basis. Okay, and then some others. So these are different combinations of how ESOPs and CSOPs could be designed to cover employees and cover customers. And again, it's the new shares would be issued and sold to either the ESOP trust or the CSOP trust. Okay. And the source of repayment or the source repayment of loans are what the customers pay in their monthly utility bills or regular riders on a metro system. And what the residual would generally be considered a rebate. So this is a little bit different than the other mechanisms that we're talking about because you have the shareholder actually as a source of repayment of loans. And this comes to the homeowners equity corporation, which is also similar in that the source of repayment are the people purchasing the homes, but they do it in such a way that rather than just individually having to go out and um, uh, bargain for the price of a home and use their personal savings, they would be able to acquire ownership through the homeowners equity corporation, which would own the actual housing properties, but the people who are buying it would be issued shares. And so as they pay off their monthly rent, that's really translates into like a mortgage payment or repayment of the loan that acquired those homes. And as time goes by, the person can either buy out their home and receive title to it, or they can just decide to keep shares in the homeowners equity corporation, which could allow them to transfer into another home of whatever the value is that the shares, for example, are worth. So it gives more flexibility and greater efficiency in terms of enabling people to acquire a house. Also, if someone cannot afford monthly mortgage, they can always use housing vouchers. So this is a way that housing vouchers can enable someone to buy a house on much more tax advantage ways. One of the things about the HEC is that it would be buying the homes at a fair market value, and generally if that includes foreclosed homes whose value has gone down, but that also enables the former residents to reacquire it at the lower cost. So there are a lot of advantages to the HEC, and we think in terms of the housing crisis, this is an idea that needs to be explored more deeply. Okay, and so this relates to the foreclosure problem. It allows you to either own shares or eventually take title to the house. Then there are various ways of designing the ownership. And here we talk about 999-year leases, which are essentially owning if you have all the rights. Um, so these are some of the benefits, and the way the HEC is doing the borrowing. So that is spreading out risk, and it's spreading out the credit worthiness of the borrower to a larger entity, that's important. Also, it enables people with maybe not great credit ratings to acquire homes by buying shares in the HEC. And yes, so got that. So what this all comes down to, whether we're talking about the ESOP in terms of what we would call a justice-based management ESOP, or we're talking about the capital ownership account, or we're talking about Citizens Land Development Cooperative, or customer stock ownership plan, there is a guiding principle and objective, and that is to turn every citizen into an owner. Thank you very much.